Hello everyone. In today's video, I would explain how reference properties and linked properties work within Pega, and I'll be using a Pega Personal Edition version 8.7 to explain the functionalities. Now, before I begin, let me introduce this series of videos because I believe that this is going to be the first of a series of videos in which I would explain beginner level functionalities which are currently, present within Pega. Now, what do I mean by beginner level functionalities? Now, I'm I'm hoping not to have to explain very basic level Pega functionalities. For example, if someone asks me what is a rule or what is a decision table or what kind of things can a, let's say, a decision tree do, those things will not be explained in the videos because I believe there are other videos in the market which explains that quite well. But these videos would explain how certain things can be optimized, how certain quirks can be utilized within Pega, and how certain things which are not very well known but can only be learned through experience can be used by system architects as well to further optimize their code and make it run faster. So I hope this will, as I mentioned before, I hope this will be the beginning of a series of videos. So let's dig into it and see how it works out. Before we try to understand how reference properties work, let's try to understand what a reference property is actually. Now, imagine you have a requirement like this on the screen. You have a, let's say, like a customer list where you have three customers, and I want to choose any one of them as a primary customer. Now, whenever I do that choice, um, the properties of that single customer which has been chosen will then be propagated further. So it can then be used to call other APIs or, let's say, send an email and do other things. Now, whenever I select that primary customer, right? So how would you then remember that out of customer list 1, 2, 3, number 2 was stored as the primary customer? Now, one approach is that whenever this checkbox is being chosen, you can set a property directly within that customer saying is primary equal to true, and then, for example, you can keep on using it across the application. That also kind of would work. Second approach is that you can maintain the index, say like create a property called primary customer index, and then keep that within your py work page layer, and let's say call it primary customer index. The value is 2. So then what happens is whenever you need a reference to the custom primary customer, you can then simply select py work page dot customer list in bracket primary customer index and then dot whatever attributes you require. Both of them would work, and I'm not saying they will not work, but they are, I would say, an incorrect understanding of how Pega works, because reference properties I think work also better. The first approach is slightly better because you're effectively adding one more attribute inside the customer. But sometimes what happens is if you are adding a property called is primary, so you sometimes are bound by the data model which the LSA has created for you. So what if the LSA does not allow you to create one more attribute called is primary, and they ask you to handle it in a different way? Then it will be difficult for you to do without informing the LSA. So that is one issue with that first approach of adding an attribute. The second approach of adding the index attribute in your py work page, again, that will be a bit difficult because then you have to, for example, remember where exactly you've kept it. Again, that can be done. I'm not saying it cannot be done, but it will also be I would say not a very good method of handling a primary customer. The third approach is, sometimes people also I've seen using that, is whenever this selection is done, take the index and then copy the entire page and put it on a single page attribute somewhere. So let's say call it py work page or primary customer info, a single page attribute, and then copy that entire thing into that page and say, okay, that page will have the information of the primary customer. That will also work, but again, there are certain issues with that. One is you are eating up extra space because this is of course a simple page of a customer. But what happens if the page list has hundreds and hundreds of pages, hundreds and hundreds of attributes? So then whenever you add copying a page, you're actually adding more weight into the clipboard, making it heavier. Number one. Number two is what happens if, let's say, one of the underlying attributes within the customer change. But since you have then copied the entire information over to a single page, then that change of that customer information will not be reflected. So that is the reason why I think a better solution for all of these would be a reference property, where you can, instead of maintaining a, let's say, a fixed set of attributes copied over from the primary customer, you can simply reference a pointer. Now that pointer will then remember where you have linked it to, and it will simply, so whenever you are, let's say, giving that property reference, and you select, let's say, the name, the first name, the last name, Pega would remember, okay, first name means the first name of the primary customer, and then show that information to you. Now one way of doing, if I okay before I go into the actual way of using it, let's just try to understand what the other scenarios are. The other scenario in which you can use, so I already explained the first one, where you have a single value attribute, and you can, let's say, and if you have a requirement to use that somewhere, what you can then do is you can use a reference property to mark which one is the primary customer, or for that matter, any kind of marking which is required. The other scenario where reference properties are used is, imagine that you have, let's say, a huge list of operators, or a huge data page somewhere which has a huge chunk of information. Now let's say that you want to use one of them inside your PY work page. Now whenever you want to use that, now what will happen is, so one approach is, of course, every time using d underscore that value, and then I'm like adding the condition onto it. But what happens if you don't want to use it? So what you can then do is you can mark, you can run the condition once and identify d underscore operator list 5 as your value which is required, and then keep it as a page reference inside your PY work page, your primary page. Now once you do that, what happens is, whenever you are actually wanting to reference that d underscore operator list 5, instead of directly using the data page, you can simply use the actual reference property inside PY work page. So then two things happen. One is you don't have to run that condition every time to deduce what is that primary operator which you want to use. And second is that even if the page is very big, it still resides outside PY work page. So your case does not become heavy. Your case information still remains light. But what you're doing is you're simply using a reference property to reference certain information outside the case scope. Now again, using the reference property will not make the information be retained even if it's not present. So if, for example, you are outside the scope of the data page and the data page is gone, so then even if you start to use the primary operator, it will not have the value, because that the primary underlying page itself is gone. So you can't reference that. So that rule still remains, that you cannot reference any property outside the scope in which it is supposed to be used. But if you're using reference properties, then you can simply use a dynamic linked property, and then you can actually use that linkage to use that page across many other places. So how that actually works out, let's find out. So let's try seeing how the actual reference property works. Okay, so what I will first show is, I actually have created a section. I'll show that. The section has a list of customers in it, and I have added a checkbox. Now in the checkbox, what I've done is I've added a activity called set primary customer. Now you might ask, why am I using an activity? Because this is one of the limitations of using a reference property, which is that it will always require an activity to be used. But I'll come to that a bit later. So let's first look at how it will benefit us. So if you, for example, look at the screen, what actually is happening is, whenever a checkbox is checked, Pega will then loop through the customer list. Okay, and then it will call this method called property ref. Now when this property ref is called, what will happen is, it will then, I have given a name, a single page property called primary customer info. And what will then it will then do is, it will then simply take the current customer list iteration, and then store it inside that primary customer info. And when that is done, the linkage is done. So how does that work? Let me just show you. So whenever I check this, you can see the name of the primary customer information has come up here. uncheck this, I choose another one, again the name is changed. Now if I go to the clipboard, you will find that there is a page. Yeah, as you can see here, the customer list is retained, but the primary customer info is now showing a bracket option here called refers to py workpage customer list, which means that it's a pointer property, it's a reference property, and whatever information you see underneath it, it does not physically reside within primary customer info. It resides within the customer list. So what it does is it simply creates a reference to that py workpage customer list, because I have selected that, as you can see here. If I, for example, somehow uncheck this and choose, let's say, the third one, and then if I save it, and if I go back to that clipboard, you will see that the value has changed. So whenever I am actually calling that activity, I'm simply looping over it. I'm checking which one has that checkbox classification equal to true. If it's true, then what will happen is it will automatically call that primary customer information and store the current iteration of the customer in it. Now, how does the single page property work? Is it is it specified in the same way that we do as a normal primary single page? No, there is a bit of a change in it. So as you can see here, if I for example change this, there is on the advanced tab there is an option called allow use as a reference property in activities. So I have checked this. So whenever it is checked, it indicates to Pega that this property will be used as a reference property anywhere. So it does not really then of course demand any kind of data loading option. So as you can see, all the data loading option is gone. So normally what you see here, the data access, this is gone, because a reference page itself will never have any data, right? It simply references some other data present somewhere. So it does not show the data access option. It simply gives you the option to choose a class, that, and that's about it. And also remember that the class that you are trying to have, the class of the single page needs to be, this page definition class needs to be same as the class which is going to be of the customer, because otherwise the single ref might not work properly. So always choose to have the same class present within this py workpage customer list, the one that I have here, this class, and as you can see, this class are exactly the same. Otherwise you might have some issues while actually using it dynamically. So let's better not do that. Okay, so that is how a reference property is used. So after the usage, as you can see, you actually are getting a new property here. I have already mentioned that. You can see the primary customer information is stored. Now once a property once a reference property is created, what can happen is you can so the reference property always remains. So it doesn't really go away until you explicitly remove it. So now there are three ways in which it can go away. One is it is re-referenced, which means that the same property is then pointed to some other page. So if I, for example, have another condition somewhere, and instead of choosing the current customer list, I explicitly choose it to customer list 3 just after this. So if I, for example, have, let's say, multiple instances of the property ref happening on the same page, primary customer info, Pega will only consider the last one, because it will keep on setting the references, but the last one will always take precedence, because but that is the one which has been done last, right? Number one. Number two is the customer, so it can be overridden by setting it again, number one. Number two is we can do it like this, where we can simply remove the property from the clipboard, and it will then be removed. I mean, it will not remain anymore. The third option is you can use a Java step. Again, this is something that I found out, but what you can do is you can use a Java step like this. You can use the clipboard property primary customer info and then take that value and then use a function, library function called reset reference information. So first it checks whether the has reference, I mean the reference property actually exists or not. If it exists, then reset the information. So if you do that, it will then flush that clipboard reference out of the clipboard. So that is how you use a reference property, and this is actually a very good way of doing it, because it does not allocate any extra memory inside your clipboard. So your clipboard remains very neat and clean. Whenever you have any requirements of using any attributes, Suppose you have a, let's say, an attribute deep inside an embedded page list. You have, let's say, a list and then a b list underneath it and c list underneath it, and then you need a c one instance of the c list, let's say directly within a list somewhere, something like that. Whenever you have any such requirements, using a reference property is the best way to do it. So before we conclude with reference properties, I think there are one or two things which need to be understood first. Now, inside, so one of the disadvantages of using a property ref is you need to, always use an activity. There is no way around it, and there will be one message which will come up. I don't know why this is coming up, but the fact is, I mean, I cannot actually use a data transform to replace this, because the property ref is not allowed using a data transform. There are some Pega functions which I am trying to explore, but as of now I've not been able to use, or let's say find something which will do that functionality as is. Number one. Number two is, and this is a very important point which needs to be remembered, that when a reference property is being used, a reference property cannot be on the same level as the reference to which it's actually being made. So let's try to understand what that means. So what it means is, let's see if I can open the case. So suppose I create a property called primary customer. So I have created a property called primary customer info. Now you can see that the primary customer info is on one level higher than the customer list, and it's parallel to the customer list. So it has no issues. But what happens if I, for example, try to set the customer list directly within the customer, I mean, set the primary customer information directly within the customer list? How will that work out? So let's see. So I will show you that. So I've created a property. Now this property is directly on the customer data object, and I have used the same reference and I have just set it on that reference. So what will now happen is, you can see this property, the page class and the applies to class, both of them are exactly the same. Okay, so that is actually I'm trying to set the reference directly within the customer list itself. Now let's see what happens. If I do this and if I run the tracer, you can see an error has happened. So what happens? You can open the tracer and see that the error will be that py workpage.customer1 list 1 is not valid. Reason: cannot establish reference to self or parent, which means that you cannot have a self reference. So you need to always be very careful on which level you are trying to set the reference to the property you're using. So that needs to be either one level higher. It needs to be, I mean, like, parallel to the structure which you're trying to create, and also it cannot be done within the same level on which the customer list, for example, resides. So be very careful about that. Now let us try and understand what a linked property is. Now I think it's best if you understand a linked property using a use case. I think that will be much better to understand. Imagine that you have, let's say, a list of operators on the screen. Let's say 10 or 15 or 20 operators. Now, the end user who's coming into the application, he or she wants to select one of the operators. Whenever that operator is selected, that operator will be marked as a primary operator. And then you need to send out an email to the operator's email address. Now, normally what happens is, if you don't have any knowledge of linked properties, what would you do? Because the list of information that you see on the screen will not contain, let's say, all the information inside the operator, right? So the email address, it will not be there. So what you will do is, you will loop through that list of operators, figure out which one of them has been selected by the end user, and then take that selected operators PZNS key, and then use an obj open by handle, and then open that full operator instance onto the clipboard, right? And then once you have that primary operator email address or something, then you can use that and then directly map it onto the required property, and then trigger an email. Now that is one way of doing it, but of course this actually has an issue, because then you need to, so suppose the customer or the front end user is actually, let's say doing that selection multiple times. The person selects one of them first, and then unchecks it and then goes and selects another one. So if you have that code on the on change of that checkbox, it will then be called multiple times, which will be difficult uh, for anyone to handle. So it is better if so then of course what you can do is, instead of doing it on the on change, you can then do it on the next button click. But even that will be difficult, because then you still have to do a obj open or an obj open by handle to get that information out, right? Now that in itself is an overhead, because you're then making a database call, you're getting the entire object instance onto your clipboard, which is adding to the weight of the clipboard, and then like getting that information out and then using it. But what if we can find a way in which we can not do an obj open or an obj open by handle and still get the information out from the information that you already have present in your clipboard? So how would we do that? Let's find out. So as we discussed before, I have a list of operator IDs here. This is actually being sourced from a out of the box data page which lists all the operator IDs. Now I have used this, and the objective here is that whenever I select any of the operators, it will automatically give me the email address associated with this. Now the email address is not part of the clipboard already, it is not present. But what I'm doing right now is, based on that information, based on whatever the user selects, I will use a linked property to query back to the database, get that email address and store it on this property value. Okay, now how would I do that? Before I go into that, let's first look at what a linked property looks like. So this is what a normal property looks like, a normal property rule. Now the key difference which we will make is not here. I mean, it remains exactly the same, but what we will do is we will choose the option linked. So when I choose this linked option, as you can see, it shows data admin operator ID. This is something I should have given, but yeah, it's actually was already there on the property. So yeah, so it simply shows the property. Now whenever I give this linked the data admin ID property, right, as you can see, it automatically gives me a property from that class called py user identifier, which is effectively the key of that. It is a key of that the class which we have selected. So what this means is, when we have a linked operator, in order for us to get that information out of that instance, we need to set the linked operator equal to the py user identifier of that instance, which means in for an operator, it is the user ID, the operator ID, which is the unique property. Okay, so let's go into the code and see how it's done. So I have written the code on the checkbox itself. I will show that here. Yeah, so you can see the data page. I have given an on change data transform, not an activity, of course. So forget about what happens when it's false. So this is just a setting of the value. Now what I've done here is I've used this linked operator. As you can see, I've set it on the py work page, not on this current page. Okay, now why have I not done that? Let's try that. So because this is the page on which the actual operator ID resides, right? But you cannot do that. I'll come to that, why I can't do it. Okay, but for now, just assume that I have chosen the py work page as the primary page on which the linked operator will reside. Now what am I doing here? I am simply choosing the py user identifier which has been of the selected row of the operator. Now once I do that, I don't do anything else. I simply keep it as simple as that, right? I just simply set a value, right, like this. So as you can see, it's a text property, but since it's a linked property, what will now happen is, if I go back to that data transform, I'll just see if I can go back to that. Yeah, so here I can use the direct, this is from the py work page. I can give the linked operator, and then I can click on dot. It will automatically give me the list of all the values directly underneath it, like this. And I can then give the value which is present. So I can give, I think, py email address. Okay, now once I give this, it will automatically work in the same way as if that I have actually obj opened by handled or obj opened the operator instance and loaded the entire page onto it, because it will have the entire information of that single page on it. So I haven't, yeah, I've already written the code, so I haven't, like, I don't want to write it again, but it's already given here. But how will this work? So let me also run the tracer just to show that. So if I select any one of them, as you can see, the operator automatically comes in. So how does this work? The code, of course, goes through that list of things. So there's only one row, as you can see, this one actually matched. So the selected item equal to true matched. So what happened is Pega automatically set the linked operator here. I set that value before. Now if you look at the linked operator property, it does not work like a reference property. It simply has the value, that's it. But whenever next time the dot linked operator is the dot linked operator attribute is referenced, it will automatically have the entire instance information directly underneath it. So of course this actually would help you save that obj open, right? And you can then directly set the value in it, and you can see that, I mean, there's nothing specific given here, right? It's just a simple way of doing it. But as you can see, Pega internally actually does a bit of querying and gets the information out. But that is not, of course, something that we have to worry about. It is automatically done by Pega, so it's not something we are doing. As you can see here, the peer underscore operators table is queried. Now apart from that, everything else is exactly how it works. So after that, of course, I'm simply setting the value back into the py email property, which is referenced here from that property in linked operator. So I have not really hard coded anything. It's simply that I'm using the py's identifier, which is the operator ID, into the linked operator, and then I'm using the email address underneath it simply by using a linked property. Okay, that's how it works. It's as simple as that. Now sometimes you might think, okay, what is the difference then between a linked operator, linked property, and a reference property? They look very similar, right? They all are let's say, referencing to some other information. Well, yes and no. So you can use a linked property whenever you need, let's say, one or two attributes from a linked page. Now if you, for example, need the entire page, and that is not coming from the database directly, if you, for example, have a need to reference any page already present within the clipboard, then you use a reference property. But if you're using a linked property, then usually what we do is we use it to reference a blob which is already present within that within Pega's internal database, but we don't want to use a separate obj open to make that work. So it is, both of them are actually using some sort of a dynamic referencing of information, but the use cases are different. Okay, so if you, for example, want to use a reference property here, it will not work, because reference property demands that the page which you want to reference is already present within the clipboard. So you then need to first get the entire information of the operator on, or like load it onto a data page of some sort, and then use that here. That is one way, but you can't directly do the obj open using a reference property, right? Similarly, if you want to go for this option, right, you want to get the information here. Now you, of course, can choose the primary checkbox here, but whenever you do that, if instead of reference property you use a linked property, the linked property usually goes to the database and then gets the information. But here you don't need that, because the information is actually being keyed in by the user, so it does not reside on the database. It's not coming from some sort of a source of or system of record, so it is already present and given in by the user. So yes, so they are very similar in their usage, but they are very different in their implementation and their use cases. So that is about it in terms of reference properties and linked properties. If you have any questions about any of them, or let's say any of the other property types that we have, do let me know. I will see if I can create a video for it, or I can answer your questions directly on the YouTube video, or any other medium in which you deem fit to contact me. So that is about it for today. If you have any questions, as I mentioned, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.